Burn the whole crate for all I care. They're not even worth a bullet. That was the last thing the witness heard before the pickup truck disappeared into the dust, leaving behind nothing but the echo of cruelty and a wooden crate cracked open. At the bottom of a dried-out canal near Fort Dillard, inside that box were 3 canine German Shepherd pups, barely old enough to survive without their mother, soaked in thick engine oil, tangled in old rope, and shivering in silence. The morning sun did nothing to warm them. One of them didn't even lift its head. Evan Price was running late that morning. A junior mechanic at the local depot, he liked to take the long back road with his coffee before the shop opened. He always said it gave him 5 minutes of quiet before the noise of hammers and hydraulics took over his life. But that morning, the quiet was broken by Boone, his dog, barking like he'd seen a ghost. Evan slowed the truck, rolled down the window, and caught the sharp scent of motor oil and decay. He followed the noise down the slope and stopped dead at the sight of 3 oil-covered lumps twitching in the dirt. At first, he thought someone had dumped engine parts, but when one of the pups lifted its head and let out the weakest cry he'd ever heard, Evan's knees nearly buckled. He didn't remember sliding down the hill, just that he was suddenly there, jacket off, wrapping them one by one, his heart hammering as if they were his own blood. He called the only place he trusted, Dr. Mara Linley's clinic, just 7 miles away. But when he tried to lift the smallest pup, it didn't move. For a moment, he thought it had died in his arms. They arrived at the clinic in a blur. Mara's team didn't ask questions. They moved fast. Saline baths, decontamination kits, careful injections to flush out toxins. The oil had seeped into their ears, their mouths, even their eyes. The ropes had cut deep. One pup's leg had begun to swell, circulation nearly lost. They worked for hours, hearts in their throats, unsure if the little ones would even make it to the evening. Mara named them to break the silence. River, for the biggest one who kept trying to crawl despite his pain. Luna, the fragile one who'd barely breathed in Evan's arms. And Echo, the one who hadn't made a sound since they arrived, eyes wide with fear and ribs like twigs under his fur. The names weren't official, just borrowed for hope. And right then, hope was all they had. Late that night, while Mara was checking Luna's vitals, the front door of the clinic opened. The man who stepped inside didn't say a word. He wore a military jacket, stained and threadbare at the cuffs, and he held something pressed flat against his chest, a crumpled photograph. His boots were coated in red desert dust. His face was hollow, like someone who'd been looking for something far too long. "I think they're mine," he said, voice raw. Mara paused. "You're here for the pups?" He nodded, then held up the photo. It showed a female German shepherd curled around 3 newborns inside a military kennel. Her name was Nyla. She was my partner. They told me her litter went to a training facility 3 states away, but when I got back from deployment she was gone, and so were they. His name was Sergeant Cale Donovan. The photo had been in his Dior chest pocket for months, folded and refolded, carried through sandstorms and gunfire, and the kind of nights soldiers don't talk about. He had promised Nyla before she was retired that he'd find her pups, that he'd keep what was left of her safe. But what he found instead were 3 broken babies clinging to life in a vet clinic, smelling of gasoline and abandonment. When Mara led him to the recovery room, he didn't speak. He just walked to the edge of the crate where Luna lay wrapped in a towel, gently breathing now. Cale dropped to his knees, the photograph slipping from his hand, and pressed his forehead to the crate. No one said a word. In that small room, with the smell of antiseptic in the air and monitors blinking softly behind them, something shifted. Not everything had been lost. Not yet. The pups weren't just strays. They weren't forgotten numbers in a failed transfer. They were a soldier's promise. They were Nyla's legacy. And if fate had bent this cruel, then maybe, just maybe, it was about to bend back the other way. Cale didn't leave that night. He stayed curled beside the crate until the sun came up. Cale didn't sleep. He sat cross-legged on the cold tile, floor of the clinic's recovery room, the quiet beep of monitors steady in the background. The pups lay curled together, swaddled in blankets, still trembling from shock and trauma. Mara had offered him a cot in the back, even coffee. He had refused both. His gaze never left them, not for a second. When the first rays of light crept across the floor, River stirred. The biggest of the 3, with a makeshift splint still wrapped around his swollen leg, gave a faint whimper and stretched his paw toward Cale's boot. That single moment shattered something in him. He reached out slowly and let River sniff his fingers. There was no bark, no growl, just a tired acceptance that said, I remember something about you, something safe. Kale's mind drifted backward. 3 years, 2 deployments, and 100 nights spent beside a steel cage in an Afghan desert where Nyla, his K9 partner, had saved more lives than any medal could account for. She wasn't just a military asset. She was the only constant in a world where bombs didn't give second chances. He still remembered her final day on base. She had been restless, pacing as if she knew something was off. Hours later, an ambush. Nyla took the brunt of the blast, shielding 2 men, one of whom still hadn't walked since. She survived for 3 days in ICU before Kale was forced to make the call. He never forgave himself for it. And when he returned from duty a year later, expecting to meet the pups she had left behind, they were gone. No records, no forwarding detail, no accountability. Just a generic letter from logistics stating, relocated to external facility. The language was cold, clipped, bureaucratic. It never sat right with him. So he searched, through channels, contacts, and conversations that led to dead ends, until Evan's blurry photo surfaced online. A rescue post, a crate, 3 puppies, soaked in oil. One glance, and Kale knew. Mara stepped into the room holding a clipboard, her eyes puffy from the night before. She softened when she saw Kyle hadn't moved. You still think they're Nyla's? She asked gently. I don't think, Kyle replied. I know. She walked over, crouched beside him, and held out the clipboard. Initial labs came back. They're all dehydrated. Minor chemical burns, mostly from the oil. One has a respiratory concern, probably from inhaling fumes, but they're strong. They fought hard. Kale swallowed the lump rising in his throat. Fighters, he whispered. Just like her. They're going to need more than strength, Mara said, standing. They need time, and a place that doesn't smell like antiseptic and fear. Kyle didn't hesitate. Take them home with me. Mara hesitated. That's a lot. They'll need medicine, vet checks. I'll handle it. Just tell me what to do. And he meant it, every word. That afternoon, Kale returned with a borrowed truck, the back lined with soft bedding and a heating pad. Evan helped carry them out, one by one. As Luna was placed in Kale's arms, she let out a soft yawn and tucked her face under his chin. Echo, still silent, followed with wide eyes that refused to blink. River, limping but alert, licked Kale's wrist once before curling beside the others. The road home was quiet. Kale drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Luna's back, steady and gentle. He didn't cry until they pulled into his driveway, a modest place nestled at the edge of a forest, far from noise, close to healing. Inside, Kale had already prepped the guest room. Clean towels, bowls, toys he had kept in a trunk marked K9. Nyla! He spread out the blankets and gently laid the pups down, one by one. None of them made a sound, but their eyes tracked him. They knew he was theirs. Over the next few days, healing came in layers. River was the first to stand and take a few shaky steps, dragging his injured leg with stubborn grace. Luna followed, tail wagging weakly when Kyle hummed an old tune Nyla used to respond to. Echo took time. He didn't bark, didn't eat unless the others did. But on the 5th night, when thunder rolled across the hills, Echo climbed into Kale's bed and curled against his chest like he'd always belonged. There. By the 2nd week, Kyle was setting alarms every 4 hours for meds. He canceled all travel jobs. He ignored every missed call from old friends. This wasn't charity. This was penance. Redemption. These weren't just pups. They were Nyla's heartbeat passed forward. One afternoon, while Kale refilled their bowls, the doorbell rang. It was Layla Clark, former military handler turned whistleblower. She had seen the same photo Evan posted and traced it back through networks Kale hadn't thought to check. Her face, when she saw the pups, went pale. Kale, these were part of the failed decommission project, the one they shut down in 21. He looked up sharply. What do you mean? Layla stepped inside and sat heavily on the couch. The pups weren't supposed to be sent to another facility. They were deemed unfit, behavioral issues from early trauma. The directive was to dispose discreetly. Someone ignored protocol and dumped them instead. Kyle clenched his jaw. And no one's held accountable? She met his gaze, steady. Not yet. Silence settled between them as River barked in the background, his first real bark loud and bright. Kyle looked down the hallway where the pups now played, tugging on a stuffed toy that once belonged to Nyla. His chest tightened. They were never broken, he said quietly. They were betrayed. And in that moment, Cale made a choice. This wasn't just a rescue story anymore. It was the beginning of a fight to make sure no soldier, human or canine, was ever discarded again. But the war was only just beginning. The news hit Cale like a gut punch. Those pups, Nyla's pups, were never meant to survive. Everything he had feared during those sleepless months after returning from service had been true. They hadn't been misplaced or transferred to another handler. They were discarded, intentionally, silently, like they were nothing more than a failed experiment. He stared at the corner of the room where River now lay sleeping, his leg wrapped in fresh gauze, a chew toy nestled between his paws. Luna and Echo were curled beside him, no longer trembling like they used to. The house had changed in 2 weeks. It wasn't just quieter, it was alive again, with cautious steps, playful barks, and the slow, undeniable return of trust. Layla had left him with files, copies of internal emails, faded documents with red stamps marked classified, and incident reports that had never been made public. Kyle had read them all through gritted teeth, fingers trembling over every line that detailed behavioral tests, chemical exposure trials, and early isolation conditioning that went against every protocol they swore to follow. These were not mistakes. These were decisions. But somewhere in that ugly pile of betrayal, Cale found something else. A name. Dr. Elridge Marrow, the man who had overseen the Canine Division's behavior study at Fort Arlen, the same man who had signed off on Nyla's debrief after the ambush, and the one who had marked her litter as non-viable. Cale didn't say a word to anyone. He packed a small bag, left Evan a note to check in on the pups, and drove 6 hours north to a sleepy mountain town where Dr. Marrow had quietly retired, far from government walls and media questions. Cale found him tending roses in a weathered backyard, his cane propped beside a rusted bench. "I didn't expect you to find me," the old man said without turning. "But I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." Kyle's voice was steady. "You signed their death warrant." Dr. Marrow finally turned, his eyes as tired as the creases around his mouth. "They weren't meant to be killed, Mr. Lawson. Only forgotten. That's not an answer." The man sighed and motioned for Cale to sit, which he didn't. After Nyla's death, the program was under pressure. Funding cuts, scrutiny over ethical practices. I knew those pups had potential, but the directive came from above. Terminate any offspring not immediately suited for integration. I stalled, falsified a few records to keep them alive long enough to be transferred, but it was out of my hands. Kyle stepped closer, fists clenched. "So they were dumped in a crate, drenched in oil, tied up in rope, and you're telling me that's mercy?" "I'm telling you," Marrow said slowly, "that someone else turned that order into cruelty, not me." Cale's breath came hard. "You had a choice." "I had a system," Marrow replied, "one you were a part of." Silence hung heavy between them. The doctor looked away first. "What do you want from me?" "Names, files, everything you buried to keep your hands clean." When Cale returned home that night, he brought more than just paper. He brought proof. The pups, now walking more steadily, even playing with Evan's shoelaces, watched him with expectant eyes. He sat on the floor, dropping the files beside him, and Luna climbed into his lap. For a long while, he just held her. The next few days moved in a blur. Layla helped organize everything into a secure database. Cale contacted a former journalist, Ava Mendez, who had once embedded with his unit overseas. She still owed him a favor, and when she saw the material, her voice trembled. "This story," she whispered, "will ruin people." "Good," Kyle replied. "They deserve worse." Meanwhile, the pups healed in ways Cale hadn't thought possible. River's limp faded with physical therapy. Luna started barking at birds in the backyard, and Echo, once silent, withdrawn, began greeting Cale at the door with a low, happy whine. Every moment reminded him of Nyla, but not in a painful way anymore. More like a pulse that still echoed through these little lives, steady and strong. The media storm hit fast. Within 48 hours of Ava's story going live, Fort Arlen was under investigation. Public outrage poured in like floodwater. Donations, letters, calls from strangers offering to adopt military dogs. Even former soldiers came forward, sharing their own stories of lost canine partners, shut-down programs, and the dogs who vanished from records without a trace. Cale didn't stop there. He formed an initiative, Project Nyla, to track, rescue, and rehome any canines discarded by the system. What started with 3 pups in a crate quickly became a movement, a mission, his new war. But late one night, when the world outside his window was quiet again, Kyle sat alone by the fire, the pups asleep around him. He watched the flames dance and whispered a name he hadn't said aloud in weeks. Nyla. They're safe. Now. And for the first time in a very long time, the ache in his chest eased. Not because the past was forgotten, but because it was no longer wasted. The battle wasn't over. But for Echo, Luna, and River, it was finally beginning. Kyle never expected to return to Fort Arlen. Not after what happened with Nyla. Not after the promises made and broken. Yet as he pulled his truck through the checkpoint, the weight in, his chest was heavier than any rucksack he'd ever carried in the field. The guard at the gate didn't recognize him, but the uniform still carried enough weight to get him inside. He wasn't here as a soldier anymore. He was here as a man, with questions, and 3 little souls depending on the answers. Inside, the hallways were colder than he remembered. Echoes bounced off sterile concrete walls that had once felt like a second home. He passed old familiar rooms, some still active, others shuttered and empty. Memories lingered in every corner. Nyla's first command run, the day she took a bullet. For him, the night he held her close while she bled out on that desert floor. None of it left him. Captain Hill met him in a back office, a clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. "Didn't expect you'd be back here, Lawson." Kyle nodded. "I wouldn't be, if 3 K9 pups hadn't turned up in a crate with oil in their lungs and rope around their necks." Hill looked down at the desk for a moment, then motioned Kale to sit. "You know how things changed after you left. Budget cuts, restructuring. Dogs that didn't pass behavioral trials were removed from the program." "Removed?" Kale's voice rose. "You dumped them like garbage. They were pups. Nyla's pups." Hill's mouth tightened. "That was never confirmed." Kale reached into his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the table. DNA results, courtesy of Layla's contact at the veterinary lab. The pups weren't just from the same bloodline. They were direct descendants. Nyla's legacy, bred behind. Closed doors and left to rot when they didn't live up to someone's expectations. Hill scanned the papers with growing discomfort. "Kyle, these results don't change protocol. You know that." "I know what's right," Kyle said, standing. "And I know you knew what was happening. There's a chain of command. Then start climbing it." Before Kyle left, he stopped by the kennel compound. It had changed. Cleaner, newer, but it still smelled like old sweat and steel. One of the handlers, a younger guy named Weston, offered to walk him through. They passed empty cages, then came to a training pen where 2 German shepherds chased a decoy sleeve. Weston looked at Kale like he wanted to say something, then hesitated. Finally, as they stood near the exit, he whispered, "I saw those 3, the ones you found. They were here, for a while. But someone higher up said they were unsuitable, aggressive, skittish. They were traumatized." Weston nodded, but they weren't broken. That night, Kyle couldn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his living room, all 3 pups, curled around him, Luna with her head on his thigh, Echo tucked beside his ribs, and River snoring against his boots. His mind kept looping through every conversation, every form, every signature. Someone out there made a decision, and that decision nearly cost these pups their lives. That couldn't go unanswered. The next morning, Layla arrived with more than coffee. She handed him a flash drive. "This came from someone inside, anonymously. I don't know who, but it's time you saw it." The files inside made Kale's blood run cold. Surveillance logs, internal communications, footage of the pups in early training, flinching at loud noises, hiding under tables, crying in the dark. They had been separated too early, deprived of basic comfort, and when they didn't meet performance metrics, they were marked for disposal. No rehabilitation, no reassignment, just quietly erased. Layla watched him from the kitchen table. "You okay?" "No," Kyle said, "but I know what I have to do." He called an old contact, someone from his unit who had retired and taken up a position in a defense watchdog group. They agreed to meet within the week. But before Kale could follow that path, there was something more immediate, more personal. He needed to take the pups back to where it all started. He drove them 2 hours out of town to an old cabin where he and Nyla used to train in the off-season. It was remote, surrounded by forest, a place full of her paw prints and echoes. As he opened the door, the memories hit hard. Nyla bounding across the wooden floor, nudging him awake before sunrise, barking at birds through the window. He set down 3 soft blankets. The pups sniffed the room cautiously at first, then explored. with tails raised and noses twitching. River found a worn tug toy under the old sofa and brought it over. Kale knelt beside him, smiling despite the tightness in his throat. "You're home," he whispered. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The same wind that had once carried Nyla's bark across miles of silence now carried something different: renewal. A second chance. The start of a war he was finally ready to fight, not with weapons, but with truth. And these 3 brave pups were going to help him lead it. The morning sun filtered through the trees like golden threads, casting long shadows. Across the porch where Kale sat quietly with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and Luna's sleepy head resting on the other. The cabin was silent, except for the distant chirping of birds and the occasional yawn from River, who had curled himself into a perfect circle by the hearth. Echo, still the most cautious of the 3, sat by the open door watching the woods, as if waiting for something or someone to return. Maybe Nyla's scent still lingered. Maybe her presence lived on in more than memory. Whatever it was, these pups had found peace here. And so, in a way, had Kyle. In the weeks since their return to the cabin, everything had shifted. The trauma the pups carried was still there, like old bruises beneath the fur, but it had softened. With time and trust, they were learning not just to survive, but to live. They barked now. They played. They learned commands not because someone yelled them into submission, but because Kyle showed them how to trust the sound of his voice. And each time they looked up at him with eyes so much like Nyla's, something inside him healed. But it wasn't just about the pups anymore. Kale had taken the evidence Layla gave him and gone public. With help from his contact at the watchdog organization, the story broke nationally. The footage, the documents, the disregard for life, it all came out. There was outrage, protests, investigations into the program's upper ranks. Hill was suspended. Others were forced to resign. And although no amount of justice could undo the pain these pups endured, it meant something that the silence had finally been broken. It meant the next litter wouldn't vanish without a trace. Kyle didn't care about being called a whistleblower or a hero. He didn't care about the interviews or the media attention. What mattered was that people saw the truth. What mattered was that no one would look at military working dogs the same way again. Not just as tools, but as souls, as partners, as family. Later that month, he returned to the base, this time by invitation. A new commander had taken over the K9 division, and sweeping reforms were being implemented. Kennel conditions had improved, behavioral assessments were revised, and for the first time in decades, the facility was opening a permanent adoption program for retired and disqualified K9s. Kale stood beside the commander at the announcement. He didn't speak much, but he didn't have to. Luna, Echo, and River sat obediently at his feet, living proof that even the most broken beginnings could lead to something extraordinary. On the drive back to the cabin, he stopped at a clearing just off the highway. Beneath a lone oak tree stood a small wooden plaque, weathered by time but still steady. It was Nyla's resting place. He knelt in front of it and traced the engraved words with his fingers. Loyal beyond duty, loved beyond words. The pups didn't bark or whine. They just stood beside him, quiet and still, like they understood the sacredness of the ground beneath them. Kyle smiled, brushing away a tear before it could fall. "They're safe now," he whispered. "You did good." "Girl." That night, as a fire cracked gently in the hearth and the pups curled around his feet, Kyle finally allowed himself to rest. Not just sleep, but truly rest. The kind that comes when justice has been served, when love has been honored, and when purpose is rediscovered. Because in the end, it wasn't just about rescuing 3 pups from a roadside crate. It was about redeeming everything Nyla had stood for. It was about lighting a path through the darkness so that no one, human or animal, would have to walk it alone again. And maybe, just maybe, it was about finally coming home.